Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to thank the organizers. Brigadier, thank you very much for the invitation to this festival of strategic thinking. Calling it a festival, the reason I'm calling it a festival is because you have lots of bands playing before the main act, and I think that we are actually the band playing before the speech of the Ministry of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Karin Kneißl. So we are creating the right atmosphere, and I can promise that we are going to give our best. Well, how are we going to do that? Since Brigadier Pasha postulated that strategy means thinking rather than acting, we have taken the liberty to think, to reflect in order to think ahead, and I would like to invite you to think along with us. Now, the gentleman whom you see here, and there is one person who's still missing, I think one chair is still missing, and I assume that our organizers are going to find another chair. So we're going to report about the following. One thing is obvious: the economy, and thus also energy and resources, are a decisive factor when it comes to strategy. In particular, yesterday's presentation last night has demonstrated this quite clearly and unequivocally. Our colleague Mr. König will, at the beginning of this panel, deal with the paradox of novelty. The concept of novelty will be looked at from the point of view of energy, resources, and the economy. The key question is what is new and what does innovation mean? Then Mr. Pasha will be talking about strategy at the level of the economy, production factors, resources as production factors, and the significance of energy in this context. Mr. Bergsman is then going to talk about the 4 key concepts in the economy that are also en vogue there. So the question is are business groups using this to sell old concepts in a new, skin, or to maybe mask what happened in the past? Then Mr. Boggs Berger and Mr. Ratzke are going to talk about aspects of energy in depth. And we have seen this yesterday. These are some very interesting aspects, and I'm afraid that we're not going to have enough time in order to deal with all of these aspects sufficiently. So we have 4 key words in the title of this festival. The key word that our colleague Krüger brought up, that's something I like, a quote from Hans von Seeckt, General Colonel. He said, there are 3 things against which the human mind is doing battle against in vain: stupidity, bureaucracy, and buzzwords. And we are going to take up the fight against buzzwords. Now, this brings me to the first speaker, Dr. Michael König, an old friend of our forum. I got to know him at the University of Applied Sciences. I have been in Neustadt, where I taught, starting in 2010, before he turned back to science. I'm very pleased myself that you did that. And in the following, his path then took him to the Business School of Vienna, where he is currently a senior lecturer in the area of strategy and innovation. Michael, you have the floor. Good morning. The organizers asked me to speak no longer than 10 minutes. I will try to stick to that, and if necessary, you'll show me the yellow card. It is, of course, quite a challenge to be short and brief and concise, because we like to hear ourselves speak as university professors. Thank you very much, dear Mr. Brigadier Peischl. Thank you for allowing me to be here, and it is a wonderful moment for me because a few years ago, you, dear Franz, and myself were together at a similar panel, and the fact that this still captivates us today means that the questions we are dealing with here are important and relevant. As the representative of a business school, the Business School of Vienna, I'm very pleased to be here because I believe that in military leadership and business there are a lot of parallels, similarities, areas of overlap, and possibilities of cooperating even more closely and to jointly develop the concept of strategy together. So I believe that it's great that I have a chance to use this opportunity here. I'm preparing for this panel discussion. I, of course, looked at the agenda and the buzzwords. As colleague Hollerer said, well, we know them. They exist everywhere: the narrative, cyber, resilience, hybridity, etc. A never-ending army. And I thought that in all of these things we have to ask ourselves a simple but fundamental question. The question, what is new? Or, to put it in more concise terms, what is new at all? As an alumnus of the Oxford Scenario program, I've also close ties with the University of Oxford, and I found a book by Professor Jour. He's not an economist, he's a humanist, a classical philologist, so the Greeks and the new, novelty and ancient Greek imagination and experience. So what colleague Schor did is something I would like to share with you in my keynote presentation, because he looked at how a culture that is known for innovations that affect all of us, namely Greek antiquity, how they saw novelties. And the essence of the book is that the Greeks had three concepts for what's new. Neos. And neos means, well, new in terms of time. It's young, it's up to date, it's never been there before. So it's only new, neos. The second concept, and that's something that is often mistaken for innovative, is kailos. That was the pioneering new, the disruptive, something that had never been here before, elementary things that will change the future. So in terms of time or in terms of a value judgment. And then there was also allos or heteros, and that was more of the same, actually. So if I produced beverages and I had 8 juices and I would introduce a 9th one, and it's a new product, but it's actually more of the same, just variations on a theme. And these three concepts of new, I think we've already forgotten those, and I think that the ability of companies and of military leadership to differentiate between what's actually new, and of course these concepts are essential in this context. Now, why is this so relevant? In business, we're experiencing a phenomenon which was worked up scientifically, which is called feral futures. Jerry Rabbits and Rafael Ramirez from Oxford published this scientifically. What does feral futures mean? Well, that's a phenomenon that corporate leaders, and I think it also goes for military leadership, well, use the wrong toolbox in a certain environment, and they turn a bad situation into an even worse situation. So they have environments where corporate planning needs to be done differently than in wild or in feral environments. So in an environment where things are chaotic, where things are happening every day, where we have to count on something new to happen, and where disruptive changes are on the order of the day. And we tend, even in this environment, to use the well-proven and trusted toolboxes. And thus we deteriorate the situation. And these feral futures are proof that we should think back to the question of what is really new. Now pull aside the curtain and think about what phenomenon are we talking about. Is it new in terms of time, so a recent phenomenon, or is it just different, or is it really a creative destruction phenomenon, as Schumpeter referred to it. I think that cultural techniques of how to deal with that have been forgotten. There's a recent study from 2018 from my colleague Rohrbeck from University of Aarhus, together with a colleague from the University of Münster, and they found that companies that they accompanied for many years, so there were some companies that looked forward to the future, and they understood the concept of novelty, and it could be demonstrated empirically that they have a higher market capitalization, they're more resistant to change, and have a higher EBITDA. So it makes sense to do strategic thinking and to differentiate between what's really new and what's just more of the same. So if it's only new in the temporal sense, only different, then we can use the classical risk management techniques. We know the probability, we know the impact, so that means that you can work with opportunities and risk measurements. We're good at doing that. But when it comes to kairos, so disruptive innovations, something strange, unexpected, risk management won't help us. Either we don't know the probability of occurrence or we don't know the impact. And in both cases, we need to use a different approach, a different tack. With classical risk management techniques, we can't act successfully here. So there are a number of alternatives, wildcard management, multiple whatever techniques. So I believe the ability to recognize what's really new, I think this is something that we need to appropriate. Pull aside the curtain and critically question all of these buzzwords, whether they aren't really just an old thing, or maybe even whitewashing mistakes, masking mistakes. And we want to be innovative, and all of those who are really dealing with innovation, they are often scared off and scared away, and then they don't act or react. And I think that's a nice conclusion to my intervention, but let me share a little intervention with you from the book of Joseph Schumpeter, Theory of Economic Development, published in 1912, that dealt with destructive innovation. And I believe you can't put it more nicely. Röpke and Stiller told this anecdote from China. Herr Ye, that's the name of somebody who's in charge of innovation, loved kites, a friend of innovation. All of his clothes had to have a dragon design on them. So all of his rooms were decorated with dragons, so dragon patterns were everywhere in his house and on his clothes. So it looked as if he couldn't live without dragons. One day, the real dragon, Joseph Schumpeter, up in the sky, found out about that. He was very pleased about that, and he thought, I'll go and see Mr. Ye. So he flew to Mr. Ye, and he wanted to visit him. But when Mr. Ye saw the real dragon, he became rigid, he froze, and he ran away. And that's something that we're seeing time and again in our corporate practice. We think that something is new, but it isn't new. It's more of the same, or it just happens to be new in terms of time. And in our strategy work, we often tend to overlook really disruptive new developments. I think this has been a fruitful input, and I'm available for any questions. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. König.
Thank you. Brigadier Dr. Hajra Pasha is our next speaker. Brigadier is a graduate of the Theresian Military Academy, and then actually worked his way up the classical officer career. He's presently in charge of a very important department, revision, in the Federal Ministry of Defense. And in addition, he works in science. He studied economics and got a PhD in economics. And in 2008, he actually became a professor in military science at the Miklos Defense University. Brigadier. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the nice introduction. I'm a bit of a monopolist in our system. I'm the only professor with a PhD in economics in defense. Now, this is not supposed to sound arrogant, but I'm 62 years old, so I'm actually there to say a few more things now. And I'm going to now focus on a few core messages that I think are important to be said. Thank you, Dr. Peischel, for a friend of many years who actually has included the economy into this community, because without the economy and business, all of life would not really be reproducible. And we cannot really have an honest discussion without considering business principles and the economy and the factors that drive the economy. And I thought, before I get into the topic, I would like to take you to the movies. An old film that I saw recently again. You may ask yourself, what is this supposed to mean here? A film that there's no talking. The interpreters got a little break. And what it shows, this film, is fire. Fire for the Stone Age economy was central for energy. What does the film also show? And this is my first poem. We Austrians in German, I actually dare say this, my mother was from Bavaria, we have unlearned this. We need to address and talk about film, about war, about wars properly. La Guerre de Fer was the original title. It was a war, an everyday war about resources. The economy is war. It's a fight for resources, to find the resources, what to say. The title of the film in German was, At the Beginning There Was Fire. So we did not take the French title and translated it as war into German. This is something that I wanted to point out because it also plays into strategy and the discussion on strategy. So I have to give you a few more details. When we took a look at the history, we see the Greeks, and the Greek translation of economia means actually allocating resources. So at the beginning, it was all about the use and allocation of resources. In contrast, in modern times, we have a wider definition. Economy is all human activities that are done with the aim of satisfying our needs in a planned fashion. So this is the strategic element in it. Who does this? Of course, agencies, state agencies, and businesses, and there is regulation of the markets. My first point of criticism, the Greeks understood it as the allocation of means in a household, a budget, income, expenses. Today, this has been blurred and has disappeared. If we look at Vienna, for example, the financial city councillor made a lot of debt, and now she is living quite well. Somebody will pay for it, and we can feel that the original meaning of this word has actually been lost and been blurred. If we look at it as a domestic market, yes, within a country, it's very important that you find the right strategy as to which goods should be produced where. But on the world stage, the world market, there, it's even more important. And I would just like to say, when I hear that there is no bugging among friends, then certainly this is not true in the business world. The Americans have actually spied on the Germans and spied on companies. 24 hours a day this is being done. And all day long, there is an economic war. It's translated into all languages. In German, we don't like using this word because for us it's a bit taboo and cannot really be transferred this well into the business world. The Americans are getting the best heads from Europe and leave us to deal with the migration problems, but they get our best heads. And the economic wars between Boeing and Airbus is actually a typical representative of the economic war between Europe and the US. And yes, I'm a fan of the United States. I am a fan of Trump because I actually believe in national economics. And actually, when I was studying, I actually also had to go for Keynes, but I am a supporter of Hayek. Hayek was an Austrian national economist and got the things right. There is social welfare in the United States for those who are working. Strategy in business. Well, there's a micro dimension and a macro dimension. And as this was already covered by the previous speaker, strategy concepts are pretty developed in business. Draga, Porter, all of them did a lot of work along strategic lines, and they dealt with the macro dimension. Now, if you now Google business strategy of Austria, you won't find much. Does this mean that there is nothing? But it is important for all states to have such a strategy, because only if you have this strategy, you can actually wage an economic war. In other countries, the French, they have this. They have an École de Guerre économique founded by a general, and the graduates are enthusiastic, and the companies are enthusiastic when they get these people, because they are able to spy on other countries. When the French actually need something from the Germans and don't get it, they might get it out of the companies by different means. The economy and the military, we don't know, hen and egg, what is the relationship, what was there first as far as strategy goes. Both systems, the military and the economy, have many things in common because they both deal with the use of scarce resources and with the competitive advantage. But who developed things first? Was it the economists of the Stone Age, or was it the old Chinese, Sun Tzu? We don't really know. What we do know, however, is that military is actually being pushed to the sidelines more and more, because the people who really have the say are the economists and not so much the militarists and the military thinkers at the military academies. What is important if we talk about strategy in the business world, it is about gaining a competitive edge, and this includes all market players. This means that for all militarists, an assessment of the situation, and then we will actually act accordingly, systematically. What do we have in common? How can the opponent harm us in the market? What is the territory like? What is the environment like? What is the business environment like? And this gets us to a point where strategy in business has a very, very big role to play when it is done correctly. And this is also true for energy. Energy comes from Greek again, has a fundamental central role, and we need energy to do anything in business. In business, any production is based on energy. The production factors, when I was studying, yes, they were derived from Adam Smith. We had capital and land and resources, and then we had technical progress. But I believe energy should actually be a separate production factor because it is so essential for the economy. Energy is a scarce good. We know it as a primary energy source and also as a secondary energy source by conversion. And now let me say a few words about Europe. And this is a big topic. We in Europe are in the unfortunate position that we are an importer of fossil fuels, and about half of the energy consumed in the European Union comes from third countries, and the tendency is increasing. Third countries, are considered as especially crisis-prone. 61% of imports of solid fuels come from Russia, Colombia, and the U.S. And actually, if we only focus on Russia here, then I would now talk about a few minutes about Russia defending. I am a fan of Putin. The axis Berlin, Paris, Moscow would actually be very good for Europe. 140 million people in Russia would actually do a lot of good for the European economy as consumers. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't have good contacts with the US, but we have to be clear. We have to look at what's happening in Europe today and what effect they have. Then, of course, it is more important than ever that all taxpayers' money should be used in order to achieve a situation that is good for everybody and doesn't just favor criminal organizations. Of course, Algeria, Norway, Russia. Norway is a great example for me how successful good management is. They have a surplus. They have an extreme surplus of energy production, and they export energy. And of course, they have a lot more room to maneuver for expenses that the citizens don't like to think about. Today in Europe, we are in the unfortunate position that many countries are so heavily indebted that there is no money left for military spending. And another point is that I consider very important. The recent developments in Syria and the Ukraine and Iraq show us that actually energy has a major influence on our economies. And finally, I'm a fan of nuclear energy, even though I'm married to a Japanese, and I was aware of all the terrible sides of the situation in the times of Fukushima, but nuclear energy and the use of nuclear energy has the advantage that countries can act independently from other countries and can get the nuclear bomb independently. And I'm convinced that also for the economy that the rich nuclear power players actually are doing better. And so my question is, why shouldn't Germany and Japan get nuclear weapons again? It would do them good for a level playing field in the international arena. Thank you.
Vielen herzlichen Dank, Herr Brigadier.
Thank you, Brigadier, for your deliberations. Next, Dr. Stefan Bergsmann. Dr. Bergsmann studied at the universities of Vienna and Berkeley. He studied political science. For some time now, he's been the managing director in Austria of the renowned consulting company Harvard & Partners. And his specialty lies in process management, organization, and something that is increasingly in demand, digitization. Dr. Bergsmann, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be able to be with you today and to contribute from the point of view of business. You can't expect military expertise from me, even though I'm very pleased for another reason that I have the privilege of being here, because many years ago I had the privilege of serving here. My military service was spent here at the National Defense Academy. We work as a consulting company trying to help companies to optimize the performance and the control of the company. And that's what I can report on. I can tell you about what moves companies. Now, In preparing for this conference, I asked how, in light of the projects that we organize here, the 4 concepts that you are discussing here are seen in our world. And I would like to tell you more about what the significance of these concepts is in the world of business. Let's start with the narrative. Narratives, the way I see it, have played a role since Apple rose and emerged as a major technology company. In the strategic debate in many companies, it is no longer so much about defining a target in terms of sales volume, the revenue or whatever. That's also important, of course, but for companies it is important to say, well, why we are here. What is the mission statement? What makes a company better than others? That's decisive in order to attract young talent. Not how big is the company, but what does this company do differently or better? And companies nowadays use narratives for that purpose. With the example of Apple, so when they talk about the strategy of Apple, they don't talk about their features or about their devices, but they talk about the fact that they make these devices available for everybody, that they revolutionize usability, and they package that into a narrative, and they use this narrative intensively. In the companies, we also see that narratives are used a lot in order to argue change. If companies are changing, and if these changes are communicated to employees and executives, they use narratives, they use change stories in order to explain to people why change is unavoidable, what the reason is, and where they want to go. So narratives are something that are used in business very intensively and has a major significance in business. Let's move on to the next concept, cyber. Well, the cyber concept is a double-edged sword, at least in business. On the one end, we have cybercrime. Is somebody, well, engaged in espionage? Is my data safe and secure? And how can you protect yourself against cybercrime? There have been some incidents here in Austria where companies, for example, became victims of cybercrime. So this is still very much in the limelight, and it is often underrated by many companies. So along those lines, companies could really learn from the military, and they could try to learn to better protect themselves. Cyber is also digitization. So under the heading of digitization, many of our customers are talking about how to automate processes, how to design their customer interface, how they can develop new products and services around their existing products, and many are thinking about how new business models can be developed and how to make money with that in future. So digitization as part of the concept of cyber is something that many companies are dealing with currently, and that's the biggest business opportunity since the invention of writing or letterpress. Let's move on to the third term, hybridity. This often comes up in companies for the simple reason that companies can't say how fast we can move from the current analogous world to the digital world. So all companies have to make do with the fact that the existing business and the existing activities will be continued, but at the same time they need to prepare for the new digital world, new digital products, services, and business models. In order to be able to do these things in parallel, companies have moved away from using dogmas and to organize everything with a one-size-fits-all approach. So they're trying to use parallel approaches in a hybrid manner. Let me give you a couple of examples. In IT, we are talking about a two-speed IT. You have the server, the traditional IT landscape, where you have your traditional applications, and in parallel, you have new modern apps and platforms that you can operate via cloud applications, or in project management. In project management, companies are still working with the classical waterfall method that we all know, specify, work out a concept, and then implement those. And in parallel, they use agile teams and agile methods. That's a hybrid coexistence. The same goes for consultation services. So companies are now increasingly using not just one principle for organization, but several parallel principles. The production is still very hierarchical, but innovation is more team-based, more networking. So we see that hybridity is something that is used very intensively by companies in business. Resilience is a bit more problematic. I have thought at length about it. I don't really know this concept in business, with the exception of some bestsellers maybe. And of course, companies need to be, well, resilient to crisis, but no company would have the idea of consciously putting itself into a position of crisis in order to emerge in a stronger way. So resilience, I think, often is used as an excuse, especially after the economic crisis. Many companies that weathered the crisis say, well, it didn't kill us, so it made us stronger. But I guess that is just maybe whitewashing. So 3 of these concepts are really new and that are used a lot in business circles, even though with a different connotation. 1, resilience is something where I am looking forward to the input coming from you and maybe the debate. Maybe something will come up that I have overlooked so far. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the debate. Mr. Bergsman, thank you very much for the very concise statement on those 4 concepts that we have been dealing with since lunchtime yesterday.
Im Bereich der
I'd like now lead over to our energy part of the panel. Dr. Josef Boggs Berger is going to be the next speaker. Dr. Boggs Berger has studied electrical engineering at the Technical University of Graz, has a PhD in this field, then worked in the scientific field before he joined the Verbundgesellschaft, the electricity group, where he is working as a risk manager in the trading company of Verbund. In addition, he is also active in the militia. He is started as a member of 1-year volunteer originally and presently as a liaison officer specialized on energy questions in Lower Austria. Dr. Boggs Berger. Thank you. Good morning. Very happy to be able to make a contribution here to this panel, and I would like to get right straight into the topic. In discussions again and again, there seems to be a great desire for peace. We notice this all the time. What's interesting, though, is that for many people are of the opinion that if we did away with the military, this was a contribution to peace. But if you know a little bit about this topic, that a vacuum would just achieve the opposite. And therefore, it is important that the willingness and the ability to defend are important things to be shown to the outside, that it's important to be able to fight as not to have to fight. This is more important than ever before. And this point actually brings us to the next thought, and that is the security for many people in Austria is not a topic because we're a safe country, and we often forget when we talk about infrastructure or build infrastructure or expand or maintain infrastructure that the aspect of resilience, and here I'm adding a few comments, are actually an important point. It's often forgotten to also think about resilience in the energy sector because it's important for the defense. And I think that in countries like Israel, for example, where the threats are all present, it's much clearer, more clearly pronounced that energy is considered an important infrastructure part. And this would be my proposal for a policy that resilience should always be considered when considering when planning new projects. May I have my transparency? I've heard that Dr. Radke yesterday already talked about energy and the flows of energy, where he touched on the topic of shale. And in connection with this, I would like to talk about a few implications in Europe. And one idea that I would like to present to you is the renewables. Renewable energy in Austria is actually being represented by water power, as in Germany. It's a political strategy to use water power. This is from a study that was done by the Cambridge University that shows what is the area requirements for various technologies in order to meet the world energy demand. And I don't want to talk about degrees of efficiency in detail, but I just want to give you a general idea what we're talking about. This study says that on an area of Romania, for example, with photovoltaic systems, the entire world could be supplied with energy. And of course, and this is why I would actually put this in relative terms, you also need the storage facilities. We know the sun not shining at night, but we know, just to give you an idea of the dimensions of how much area would be needed for this technology to actually meet the entire world demand. So a good voltaic site would be a place like Southern California, for example. For wind power, the area needed is much larger. Here too, if we take a good site, for example, offshore Scotland, we would get a pretty good yield. And for biomass, this is impossible. And if we did it to cover to meet our energy need, we wouldn't have anything to eat. So biomass is not going to be the strategy of the future, in short. This is what I wanted to just mention as an input, and a thought connected to this is, if we implement this, our oil demand is going to be much less. It's going to reduce. Of course, we will still need it for jet planes. Fossil fuels will remain, but we will actually need significantly less in the fossil fuels. And those economies that live on producing these and exporting these products will probably in the future see some problems as a result. My next point then actually goes in this direction, renewable energies. And in the past, our grandfathers and fathers, they built power plants because it was the principle of economy of scale that showed that it was better to produce more units, because this was going to lower unit costs. And at that time, it made perfect sense. It has led to an infrastructure, the way we do organize the power supply today. But the next technology is photovoltaics is ready. And if we have a higher degree of efficiency here and greater coverage, we will have more resilience, because transport is not needed. It covers large areas, and of course, because it is decentral, it cannot be interfered with so easily. So this is an interesting point. If the development progresses, that on the one hand the CO2 emissions are being reduced, and at the same time, for the same money if you want, we have more resilient systems, and that will feed electricity into the system. And as you know, electricity pushed by the book Blackout is everywhere in our lives. And if it's just a small control unit for something else. So the basic principle here that can be derived is that decentral concepts have a swarm resilience derived from swarm technology from other areas that actually is much higher in a central concept. And also, I would like to add a further thought here, and that is that all of you here are familiar with, but can actually see and feel in your everyday lives and make a contribution to personal resilience. Think of something as simple as a camping cooker. A camping cooker doesn't cost anything. It's in your basement. It will last forever. If you are lucky, you won't ever need it. But when you need it, it's there because it's in your basement. And this may make a contribution to your life quality because when you think of preparing food, if you don't have this cooking stove in your basement and there's a situation where you may need it, then don't think of going to Bauhaus because within a few hours in such a situation it will be sold out. And this idea of having provisions at home is also something that adds to the concept of resilience. Thank you very much. Thank you. Please use a microphone. No microphone is being used here. Please use a microphone.
So late at night, at 7:30, we talked about the challenges of the new energy situation for geopolitical understanding. Mr. Radke is the CEO of the Global Energy and Policy Analyst Group. He's also the editor of the monthly report on geopolitics. Mr. Radke, please continue with yesterday's presentation. Thank you. Yes, once again, good morning. I guess we can still say good morning. It's 11 o'clock. So let me talk about some of the questions I was asked yesterday. So yesterday we talked about the new geopolitics of energy. And in one of my arguments, I pointed to the fact that the so-called second shale revolution in the US, Shale 2.0, in the past 3 or 4 years has led to a situation where there's been an increase in the number and the productivity by a factor of 6. So productivity has quadrupled, and energy isn't a rare substance. We have plenty of energy, oil and gas. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that possible because everybody was afraid. Now, I would like to talk about a question that I asked in the following. So the situation of OPEC has, of course, dramatically changed as a consequence of shale oil and gas, and there's a new form of cooperation and harmonization between OPEC and Russia. We are witnessing this and have been witnessing this in the past 2 days here in Vienna. Then Mr. Schifter came and see me and said, "Are you sure that this cooperation between the Russians and the Saudis will be maintained? Because the Saudis depend 100% on what's happening in Washington." And with Trump, they now have a man who is consistently going to act against Iran. Now, I believe that the decisive question that we've been discussing for a few years is that OPEC can no longer correct or amend the oil price as it used to be able to do. We said analyzed as down and out, and then OPEC came back. it formed a non-OPEC, so an alliance of 64 countries that produce 60% of the world oil production. And the core of this group are the Russians and the Saudis. The Saudis tried this in the past, but they were always disappointed by the Russians. They always promised and never delivered. Now they have delivered. They have implemented a cut, and they sustained it, so the oil price rose above $75 per barrel in the direction of 80. Now they're trying to slow it down. So the starting point for his question was that Trump asked the oil price to go down, and the Saudis said, well, wait a minute, we have to ask first. Who? Well, Moscow. And now this was criticized. So do you believe that this is a long-term development? Yes, I do believe this is the case. Why do I believe that? Well, because shale oil is here to stay as a common enemy of business, even though I'm not in favor of militarizing business. And I believe that what the energy minister of the United Arab Emirates said, namely that this cooperation between Russians and Saudis is a long-term perspective. That's a new normal, as he called it. That's something that will continue to apply because so many mutual agreements have been made. And the problem lies in the fact that, well, the Russians are now cooperating with the Saudis, and they're working with the Iranians, and the Saudis are working with the Americans. So how can we solve this bazaar of different interests in order to have a hierarchy of interests? I think this is an unanswered question, but the generally valid question is, well, they just want to drive the price up, and when the price is up, then they will fall out again. But we believe that this is a completely wrong perspective when it comes to assessing this new relationship between Russians and the Saudis. So much on yesterday's point, and this is something that, well, I had to mull over. Now, the other question, that's something that we didn't talk about yesterday, was the European gas market. Now, let me share a few ideas with you in that respect, because this may give you, well, pause, or maybe be informative at least. Now, once again, in terms of the technology of producing shale oil and gas, with this enormous productivity, America is losing its interest in the Middle East, that was driven by energy, and is now looking to the biggest gas market of the world, namely Europe. So they want to export gas to Europe, and at the same time they're looking toward the Asian markets, that is to say China and India. We here in Europe, and you here in Austria, have discussed this ever since Putin last came here. The European gas policy, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, where OMV has a share. So basically it boils down to two things in this political argument. It's about the future gas market situation here in Europe. It's about how much LNG will be coming from the US as opposed to Russian pipeline gas, and how dependent is Europe making itself from Russia. Put politically, we could say that in this entire debate, the political core is the relationship of Europe between Russia and the USA. So this is what the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is, well, burdened with. And there are two questions that go far beyond Nord Stream, because you could say that Nord Stream replaces the Ukrainian transit pipelines. But if this transit stays, of course, it will remain, of course, then there's another problem. And my colleagues in Oslo said the following. Norway will not make available more gas for Europe. It will not be able to. Norway has reached its peak and will slowly go down again in terms of production volumes. That's the first thing. Second, LNG coming from the US may not be coming to Europe after all, because it's too expensive and because in the Asian market the prices are much higher. As Carlos Pascal said it 5 years ago, why should we deliver to Europe if we can make twice as much in Asia? And a third point, Russia is delivering record amounts, 200 billion cubic meters. The total consumption here is 540 or 550 billion cubic meters. Turkey is also included in these figures. Otherwise, Russia would already account for 40% of European gas supplies. And Russia is saying, well, we're going to increase this. It won't stay at 200. In 3 or 4 years' time, we'll be at 400 billion cubic meters. Of course, Norway can't deliver anymore. The Netherlands, Groningen is down. LNG, well, it will go where it can make most money, and for the foreseeable future, that's in Asia. So where will Russia deliver to? Russia can undercut all the prices of LNG here. So they can deliver at $4 per unit. And the Americans can provide LNG at $7, so with a markup. So the question is, have you Europeans really thought this out? If Russia will cover 60% of your gas supplies because they can offer the better prices. Now the Americans are saying, just think of your energy security. And interestingly, in the past, they argued differently. When we asked in 2014, can we get more LNG for you at lower prices? Carlos Pascal answered, that's the highest energy diplomat in the State Department. Well, we will sell to where we can make most money. That's in Asia. You could get twice as much there. So the energy security of Europe, well, was of no interest to them. Now, 2 years later, his successor, Ms. Holsten, said, we have to ensure the energy security of Europe. Well, what had happened? The Asian markets had collapsed, and all of a sudden they could get a better price in Europe. And now it was about securing energy security in Europe and not a free market. And that's a dilemma that the European Commission are facing. If you want to contain the share of Russian gas at 30%, then you need to regulate the market. But the Russians are now saying, we want a free market in Europe. And the EU Commission is saying, 30%, when we're now going towards 40%, so the free market means whoever has the best offer. Now, if you were to regulate and say everybody gets a fair share, then you need to fully regulate the market. Then you no longer have a free energy market in Europe. And that's the dilemma that the European Commission are facing. There's no way out. We'll see how they oscillate back and forth. And the question we need to ask is, what should be the maximum share of a single country in supplying Europe with gas? That's a real question. And that goes far beyond the question addressed by Nord Stream with its 55 billion cubic meters. That's not really all that much. But politically speaking, of course, this is, a charged subject. Now, 2 comments. Do we have other possibilities of getting gas from elsewhere? Yes, we do. Well, the southern corridor. Gas comes from Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, via Greece, Albania, through the water all the way to Italy, the TAP pipeline. 9 billion can come from there. Russia delivered 200 billion cubic meters to Europe last year alone. TAP will give us 9 billion, just a trickle. Now, currently, they're not making any progress because they can't go through Italy. They can't land the pipeline in Italy because of olive trees or whatever. So it's 12 kilometers away from the coast. Maybe Nord Stream 2 will be finished before the tap line. Now, the second possibility is that you can get gas from the Mediterranean. Israel has gas. Cyprus has gas. But just imagine we all have gas and nobody wants it. So Netanyahu and the president of Cyprus and president of Greece meet and they say we're going to build a long pipeline to Europe for gas from the Mediterranean. That's a narrative, one where they all look good and everybody knows it's never going to happen. At the current prices, it can't be built or financed. So Mediterranean gas, no way. Now, the third point, the Caspian Sea. I'm here in Vienna, we have OMV here, and OMV, once upon a time, you remember the Nabucco pipeline, 64 billion cubic meters coming from Iran. well, there are Iran sanctions, so let's take it from Turkmenistan. They have just as much gas. Moscow saying, no, not with us. So a pipeline that is built from Turkmenistan through the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan and Europe, that's out of the question. We are selling to Europe, the Russians said. So for 20 years, or for 21 years, Russia and Iran have been blocking all possibilities for what the Caspian Sea gas can mean in legal terms. So they are preventing pipelines from being built. And now, for the first time in December of last year, there's been the announcement we have a joint agreement. We have a draft, we can sign it, about the legal status of the Caspian Sea pipelines, etc. So they want to sign in autumn. Well, why that? Because, that's our interpretation, Russia has more respect, not fear, of the Chinese influence around the Caspian Sea becoming so strong that they might lose their influence because they're blockading everything. So they prefer to agree to this agreement in order to preserve their influence in the region, because Turkmen gas, well, even the Turkmens can't get gas to Europe because the $4 per million BTU, that's a Turkmens, they can't deliver that. So we can't really hope for a lot of gas coming from that region either. So in future, well, let me put it cautiously, we have a strategic problem. Thank you for your attention.
Herr Dr. Radke.
Dr. Radke, thank you very much for these highly interesting strategic points you made on the energy topic. We have a little time for a discussion, and I'm looking forward to that. We have 15 minutes time for question. But please use a microphone.
Very interesting discussion. I would especially like to, I think it's important though that we are clear in some of the things that we talk about in terms of the details. So it is important that economics and politics are inextricably related. I think that the comment that the Brigadier made about spying needs to be taken in context. First of all, industrial spying is across the globe. It's done by everyone. What you didn't mention, and it surprises me, is the influence of Chinese spying and the difference between the way the Chinese use the information that they glean from other networks to feed directly into their industries, right, which is something that we've not seen that kind of behavior in other nation states. So I just think it's critical that we think about that when we use terms like, you know, this country or that country are spying on each other. Clarity is actually important and quite useful here. The other thing you mentioned, and I appreciate your desire to have your opinion about your desire to have closer relationships with Russia and with Putin for lots of different reasons. But you mentioned because of the consumer base. You, of course, know that the gross domestic product of Russia is something south of the state of New York. So in terms of a large consumer base, one wonders just how much of that consumer base would actually be realized. And the last question that I would ask to all of the members of the panel, if you could comment on the current state of tariffs and what's happening with tariffs across the globe, and how the use of tariffs by countries seems to be getting more animated, and how that affects the comments that you just made about the greater economic policies across Europe and globally. Thank you.
A very brief answer here. In connection with China, I don't want to say too much because my Japanese bias might actually be misunderstood. On Russia and the consumer base, of course, it takes time until you actually can address 100 120 million, 140 million people. But for Europe, it would be essential because these markets are very close by and they need to be developed. So it would make sense to actually integrate Russia more on the market level. Russia was never aggressive. The entire Cold War was being promoted by the armament industry in the US and by the Europeans. I know, this is controversial. Coming back to your question now on China, I would like to say that China, for me, has a certain charm because when Trump actually met the North Korean dictator, I actually compare it to Chamberlain and Hitler. You were actually shaking hands with a dictator. It was easier then in the old days because there were no nuclear weapons yet on both sides. But all it shows is that a country that has nuclear weapons is taken seriously. And Kim was received by Trump because Trump knows that nuclear weapons are dangerous, and we don't know what ultimately this Kim is planning. And North Korea is a country that is so deep in the possession of the Kim family, is actually the cruel dictatorship, the most cruel dictatorship we have ever seen. A similar case under mitigating circumstances is, of course, also China, because we must not forget that this is a dictatorship of somebody who was extended as a president. There are no freedoms in China. And this is something that I was allowed to publish in OMZ. The only thing that would help would be the virus of democratization in China, because then China could be included again into the world community. They have money, they have nuclear power, they are interlinked in the world economy. Also, the US would have a hard time if China actually was affecting what's happening in the US the way Soros did it. And I actually got my PhD in Hungary, and I know what's happening in Hungary. And it's small wonder that when people have strange attitudes to Soros. I have a concrete answer to your question, how to deal with terrorism in companies. What we have seen, similar to the phenomenon explained by my colleague Boggs Berger, that it is important to protect critical infrastructure, also in case of terrorist attacks, surprise attacks. And we have seen again and again with company boards, they need to learn that they have to adopt the right communication strategy and to have a plan B in their drawer. You cannot ignore this any longer. Markets are affected fundamentally. It may actually kill off your sales and success as a company, and companies are learning how to deal innovatively, and along these lines they are becoming more resilient and are better prepared. I would like to add here that what my colleague said is, the one point is, and I would like to put it in such terms, what North Korea has taught us: if they have the nuclear bomb, they are not going to get attacked by the United States. And I hope not that this is the message, but it could be interpreted that way. And the other point I would like to make is that we have communication speeds in the meantime. I don't know what term to use right now, but they are breathtaking. Let's put it like this. I'll give you one brief example. We had a great gas accident at Baumgarten at the handover station to Austria. and we had a fire there. The flame actually started at 8:45 in the morning, and 5 minutes later at 8:50 on Twitter there was the first post by a balcony, from a balcony in Vienna, where people made a photo, put it on the Twitter and said, no, this looks like a fire at the Baumgarten handover station. This is where the natural gas comes, Russian gas comes into Europe. And at that point, the fire brigade in Baumgarten didn't even know that there was a fire. Nobody else had an idea. And 10 minutes later, after the fire started, you get a call from the media and are asked for a statement. So this is the speed that I was referring to, the speed created by the social media. It is breathtaking indeed. Thank you for this very interesting presentations. I'm worried a little bit, and therefore my question to you all. We know, and this was an example that was given at the beginning, what about the large four companies, the FAGA, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple, the big four? They are making so much money out of big data. And what can we do to control big data? Especially, this is directed to the business people. How can you be sure that these four players are actually behaving properly? Because the big data and the speed of communication, it's been a breathtaking development. It is something that, how can this be controlled? And this is my question. Who can decide? The big data, they are out there. This is a worldwide phenomenon. And this is actually something we should include into the discussion and also include into our strategies. And this is something that's in the interest of everybody. Thank you. It's very difficult to control it. Here is my answer. I believe that Europe, with the data protection regulation, has made a first step. From the point of view communication, this was done very poorly. Everybody got the impression, ooh, this is just another Brussels red tape regulation that actually makes us all suffer. But there is a lot of behind it. It's an active regulation body to protect data. And if you haven't noticed yet, it used to be like this, that when you clicked, you got a menu, and there was a tick saying, I agree to the data being used. So you didn't have to do anything else. And now this is forbidden. It's no longer possible. You have to actively actually agree to the data, and any private company has to have a concept for data protection, what they do with the data collected. And I personally believe this is a very good idea. It's consistent. Of course, this may cause a lot of headache for some people, but I believe it is a first very important step in order to at least go in the right direction of control. So, I see this in a similar way. It's very difficult to control, and the EU regulation on data protection is too small a step. From my point of view, the data and the internet world in the meantime has become a monopoly world. And what we can do against it is, this is something where nations and the EU are called upon, that they actually force these big players into a set of rules, as it is also true for other corporations. The big four that you mentioned, they don't do this in many areas. And it is important to take action. This basic data protection regulation is a first step, but not enough. I also do hope that in more open competition would actually be beneficial, and that also Europe is called upon to do more on the innovation side that would lead to more competition. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I have bad news and good news. Good news. We will start right on time, 11:30. The bad news, we cannot accept any further questions, at least not here in the plenary, because there is time over lunch. If you have more questions, you may ask them on a personal basis during the lunchtime. I would like to thank the organizer for inviting us. I would like to thank the panelists and the audience, and I would like the panelists for their time and effort, for their contributions. Also thank them for being short. This has been wonderful. And if dinner tonight is going to start a little later today, it's not our fault. Thank you very much.
Lieber Franz, danke für die Pendelführung.
Dear Franz, thank you for having managed this panel. Thank you for being a facilitator. It's important to have this panel on economy and resources. It has fulfilled my ideas. It is important. It's a constitutive contribution. So thank you very much for that. And the discussion will continue during lunch and whoever's there for the fireside chat in the evening. Okay, I would like to thank our panelists. Please do remain seated. We'll continue as scheduled.